Please turn to page 154 for our thinking notes using compare or contrast. These thinking notes are so that you and your students together can take information that you have learned. Typically, we are taking information that they have learned in science, in social studies, but compare or contrast can be used in language arts, math, any core subject. The basis of compare or contrast is for you to take two or more items, events, reasons, information, things, and compare or contrast them for a purpose. This is a thinking activity because when you compare or contrast, you are going to deep levels of analysis. Let me explain. Marzano, Pickering, and Pollock came out with their research called Classroom Instruction That Works, and their number one strategy was similarities and differences. The problem, though, is this. When I first started looking at similarities and differences, I always went to the Venn diagram. Let me show you what I mean. On the bottom of page 154, I'm going to draw a Venn diagram. Please don't write this in your manual. We're going to come back and use this box for a different purpose. I'm just doing it to show you why I'm not using the Venn diagram for this particular activity. When I would finish a unit of study, for example, I was working with a second grade class that had studied all about frogs and toads. They knew all this information about it. So, as one of my thinking note activities, I thought, I'll have them analyze the differences and similarities between frogs and toads. I'm going to take out the Venn diagram. So I got a piece of butcher paper, drew a couple of big circles that intersected with each other, and voila, I have my Venn diagram there. Then on one of the circles, I wrote frogs. On the other circle, I wrote toads. This is your typical compare and contrast activity. After a unit, after kids know a lot of information, let's go ahead and put up the Venn. So I did that. I had all the kids look at the charts in the room that we had on the walls about frogs and toads, review their packet of all the information that they had gathered together about frogs and toads. I had them discuss all the information they knew. So imagine all of these second graders sitting together at their desks, or you could have them come to the carpet and talk about all this information with each other. Then I stopped the group and said, all right, you reviewed everything that you know about frogs and toads. Let's now organize it and put it up on our Venn diagram. So I showed the kids the diagram and said, look over here. This circle is for us to record everything we know about frogs and this one about toads. And in the middle where they intersect, that's when the information is the same about both of these creatures. At this point, the room suddenly went quiet. There was no more talking. When I asked them, tell me what's similar, what's different about frogs and toads, the kids really didn't say much. The kids just stared back at me. So I'm thinking, what am I going to do here? How am I going to get them to come up with these ideas? And finally, one of the students said, oh, I know a way that they're the same. And I was relieved. Oh, thank goodness someone has an idea. And then he said, they both have eyes. Yes, they do both have eyes. So I drew some eyes there. And at that point, all the children started raising their hand and shouting out all the different things that they had that were the same. And this was skin, a tongue, legs. And really, that's not what I was looking for. So it was very frustrating when I did this compare or contrast. And later, when I actually looked at what am I trying to do when I'm having students compare or contrast, I'm trying to get them to analyze these items so that they get to a deep level of thinking. This Venn diagram is actually a way for you to just take all the information you know and sort it out by how, in this case, frogs and toads, what they have that are different or similar. But it's not going to take you to the deep thinking that we really want that compare or contrast can do. Look at page 155. On this page, we have a true contrast. Notice on both headlines, on page 154 and on 155, I have the words or, compare or contrast. If we want our students to go to a deep level of thinking, We need them to do either one or the other. And here's the reason why. When you start a compare and contrast, the first thing you need to do is come up with a reason why you're doing this. Why are you showing how these two or more items are similar or different from each other? We have to come up with a big idea, a reason for this analysis. So here on my organizer that has been completed here about frogs and toads, you will see the top section is going to be for our big idea. The middle section, the body, is going to be where we have that analysis. And finally, the bottom, the conclusion, is going to basically repeat the big idea and also leave us with more information about why this matters. Let's start at the top. The steps that we went through and what needs to be in this particular type of analysis. At the top, we have basically a topic sentence because this organizer will actually become a paragraph. It could become a multiple paragraph or a paragraph. In this case, we used it to write a paragraph. The top section, we used our SS light bulb to create our big idea. And what we did basically was, I told the students, boys and girls, we've been studying about frogs and toads. We're going to use our thinking notes to go to a deep level of analysis where we're going to look how frogs and toads are different from each other. So before we do that, you need to say, what's the big idea about frogs and toads being different? Oh, I can't just discuss how they're different. I need to come up with a reason why we're even doing that. So let's put our SS light bulb on our organizer. So we have our SS light bulb. The first S is for setting. We're talking about all year long on the planet Earth. So I drew a couple of icons. Your students and you could do this organizer together, or you could have them come to the carpet and you could be doing this organizer up on a big piece of butcher paper, or they could just be sitting at their seats with all their information about frogs and toads, and you could actually be making the organizer on a document viewer. Regardless of how you do this, the whole purpose at 2nd and 3rd grade is that you're having your children think. This is where you're guiding them through this thinking process. So we have our SS light bulb, the first is setting, and we have our icon for all year long, and then we drew an Earth on the planet Earth. So this information that we're talking about, frogs and toads, is happening all year long on the planet Earth. We go to the middle S, and that's S for subject. Who or what is this information about? And we're analyzing frogs and toads. That's our subject, frogs and toads. Then we go over to the light bulb. What's the big idea about frogs and toads? What are we going to do when we look at frogs and toads? We are analyzing frogs and toads. We are going to show their differences. And at this point, and this is the critical piece, is who cares? Why do we need to know their differences? Oh, their differences explain how they survive differently. Oh, so they survive differently. There's different things about them. They have similarities, but their differences explain how they survive differently. At this point, our big idea is frogs and toads have many differences, which explains why they survive in different ways. I use the word difference. Let's change the word to diverse. Frogs and toads have many differences, which explains their diverse ways of survival. Ooh, excellent. We not only have our big idea up there, but as we recorded it, we practiced, we rehearsed many different ways to say that big idea. After this big idea, we are going to go to the body. The body is where we are going to analyze their differences. And those differences that we are going to use are only the ones that explain how they survive differently. We have to stay focused. The body is all about analyzing how they survive differently. Let's use our hand sign so that we can understand how to organize this information, how to analyze their differences. So I'm heading towards the body and I'm using my hand signs. Remember, you can always go back to the video in this table of contents where I went through every single organizer and the hand signs. The critical point of the hand signs is they are a great memory tool for your students to remember how to fill in the body of the organizer. And in this case, we're going to use the hand sign that shows to contrast the information. I have my big idea. Frogs and toads have many differences, which explains their diverse ways of surviving. We go to the body of our organizer, and in the body, before I fill it out, I'm going to say my hand sign to remind myself what I need in the body and the order I go in which I fill it out. So my hand sign for the body of contrasting is identify the attributes, contrast them, and show the effect. Identify the attributes. In the body of our organizer, you'll see that we identified 3 attributes. I'm underlining them now. The first was color. The second was legs and feet. The third was skin. These were the attributes we identified to analyze the differences between a frog and toad to show how they survive differently. Their color, legs and feet, and skin are attributes that show how they survive differently. After we identify the attributes, underneath each one of these, we will draw a T-graph. Notice the T-graph under color. Then I wrote frog and toad. Underneath legs and feet, we had our T-graph, frog and toad, and underneath skin, frog and toad. At this point, once we've labeled those, we'll go back and we know we've labeled the attributes. Now we're going to contrast them. And when we contrast using our T-graph, we'll say, frog, what color is a frog? And in our circle, we wrote green and blue. Once we wrote green and blue, then we went to toad. What color is a toad? And then we had brown, gray, black. After we identified those differences, then we have to show the effect. And that means, how do those colors affect the way the frog and toad survive? What's the effect of those differences going back up to the big idea? And the effect of these differences are, the frog, typically green or blue, it's going to use that as more of a camouflage because it's mainly around water, so it can hide itself from its enemies. While a toad is more gray, brown, black, meaning that it's going to also camouflage, but it's going to use that camouflage more in wooded areas that have those same particular colors. So notice what we did here. We identified the attribute color, then we contrasted what a frog and toad's color were, and then we went back and showed the effect of those colors, how it affects the way they survive differently. We went and did the same thing for their legs and feet and their skin, showing their differences and showing the effect of those differences. At the bottom of this organizer, we have our conclusion. That's where we're going to go back and repeat this big idea, as well as why it's so important. So we had our S, subject at the bottom. We went up to the top and said, we said frogs and toads. We don't want to have to say frogs and toads if we don't have to. Can we come up with another way to say frogs and toads? And in this case, we said amphibians. Then we went to the big idea, have many differences. So we said adapted differently. And then we had, which explains why they survive differently. And we went over here and said, which explains why they live in their own unique environments. At this point, we go back to our organizer once all the information is filled in and we've completed our analysis. We could orally rehearse how we're going to write it. As you orally rehearse all this information, you may find that the students need a list of contrast words, words that will help them as they contrast their ideas. These are your signpost words. Notice on page 154, I have these listed out, and these could be words like in contrast, however, yet, but, on the other hand, otherwise, although, even though, still, in spite of. As you're rehearsing your paper, if you need to use any of these signpost words, I suggest you have these words listed out on a piece of chart paper right next to the organizer so that the students can see the different signpost words and utilize them as they orally rehearse this information. Once they can read their organizer well, they have all their punctuation on there, then they go to write. There's many different ways that you can do this activity, but your main focus is that you're using it to have children think at a high level. Let's walk through these same steps. Here, what did we do on this page? We contrasted. Let's go back to page 154 and compare. But in this case, let's use a different subject. Let's use literature. This is what's so wonderful about compare or contrast, is that students are using it to think at a deep level in any content area. We used it for frogs and toads. Let's use it for literature. And in this case, we're going to compare, because remember, we have to either compare or contrast. And in this case, we're going to compare this time. And what are we going to compare? Literature. Let's compare two characters from the same story, from different stories. Let's compare two characters from two different stories. We will compare Goldilocks and Little Red Riding Hood. In this comparison, when we finish, it will become information writing, informative explanatory writing, not a narrative. We're using narrative writing, the characters from narratives, in order to analyze how two characters, in this case, are similar to each other. So this particular piece of writing will end up becoming informative explanatory writing, where we take kids at a deep level of thinking. When you start this activity, all your students could have a blank piece of paper in front of them. On the bottom of page 154 is my blank piece of paper. I could have this displayed up on the wall in a large piece of butcher paper where I record the information, or on a document viewer. The students have paper in front of them, or if this is the first few times that we do this particular activity, they could come to the carpet, and I'm just putting this up on my big piece of butcher paper. So they are just doing the thinking piece. They're not even recording the information at the same time. So you have a better flow. When they've done this activity many times with you where you're recording it on the organizer, then they can do compare or contrast with you where they're also filling in the organizer. Let's go through the steps of how we would do a compare for two characters. Boys and girls, we just finished reading Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks. Let's compare these two characters. And at this point, I have the kids go, who cares? Why do we need to compare them? What's the reason to show how they're similar? Oh, let's go to the top of our page. Let's draw our line and put our SS light bulb for our secret formula to make our big idea. And our big idea is to explain why they're similar, the reason why we're going to show their similarities. The first thing we're going to do is say setting. We're not going to even put the setting there. It's not important. Go to the second desk, subject. Pretend like you're holding up the books and say, subject, who or what are we comparing? And in this case, we're going to compare Little Red Riding Hood. So I'm just going to put the initials, and Goldilocks. So I'll put Goldilocks here. Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks. Go to our big idea. What are we going to do with Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks? What type of analysis? We are going to compare them, show their similarities. So we are going to now show that they have similarities. Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks have many similarities. So we're rehearsing that. And at this point we say, who cares? Why do we need to analyze their similarities? Whenever we're analyzing, compare or contrast, the whole reason why we do something is to explain why, and then you fill that in. So we will look at their similarities to explain why both characters ended up getting into trouble. Oh, that's great. Yes, they did. Both did get into trouble. And it's similarities that they had that explain why they both got into trouble. Let's read our big idea so we really know why we're going to do this comparison. Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks have many similarities, which explains why both got into trouble. That's a great big idea. I love it. We have our topic sentence at the top. I'm going to draw a line down at the bottom so I have an area for my conclusion, but we are heading to the body now. And in the body, we are going to use our hand signals. What are we going to do? We're going to compare. So the hand signals are my memory device to help students remember how to fill in the body, what elements I need, and the order I do it. So we know we're looking at their similarities to explain why both of those characters got into trouble. Let's use our hand signs to figure out how to analyze. What are we going to put in the body? Name the attributes to show their similarities, compare those attributes, and then show the effect. So attributes, compare, show the effect. What's the first thing we're going to put on the body? The attributes. And in this case, we have to figure out, what did they have? What happened in the story? What did they do? What did they say? What was similar in the story between those two characters that got them into trouble? Those are the attributes that we are identifying in order to see how they are similar. So as we started to talk about the story, both stories, we saw that, both of them were alone in the story. Yes, they were. There's one attribute. And when they were alone, let's go back to our big idea. Being alone, did that get them into trouble? Yes. All right, let's have that as one of our attributes. What's another attribute? Well, another attribute is, both of them were dealing with strangers. Yes, they were dealing with strangers. So let's see. Both were alone, dealing with strangers. So we're going to identify two attributes this time. Name those attributes. One is they were both alone. The other was they were both dealing with strangers in some way or another. So one may have been dealing with the actual stranger, the other with their home, but it was dealing with something strange, the unknown. Excellent. Once we name the attributes, then what are we going to do? Compare. We're now going to show how these similarities between these two characters of being alone or dealing with strangers got them into trouble. So we're going to make our T-graph. And on the left side, I'm going to put Little Red Riding Hood. And on the right side, I'm going to put a G for Goldilocks under the T-graph for alone. Let's go to stranger and do the same again. Little Red Riding Hood and G for Goldilocks. They're similar because they were alone. So let's look at, how was Little Red Riding Hood alone in the story? Well, she was alone in the story because she had to travel a long distance to get to her grandmother's house, all by herself. How was Goldilocks alone? She went out picking flowers in the forest, and she ended up getting lost. But they were both alone. And it's real important that we show children that what we're looking at is how they're alone. We're not going to be able to compare events or actions or things characters say where they're an exact match. It's the attribute, the fact that they're alone, is how we match them, how we show the similarities. So in this case, we have Little Red Riding Hood was alone, far away, deep in the forest, traveling to grandmother's house. Goldilocks was alone, deep in the forest because she was picking flowers and got lost. We have our arrows now pointing to the same box. The effect affects them the same way. Little Red Riding Hood is far away. Goldilocks is out in the forest far away. How does that get them into trouble? Well, both of them are young little girls out deep in the country alone, and no one is there to protect them if someone dangerous comes around them. So how does that get them into trouble? They're little, they're young, and they're unprotected. No one can protect them. Let's analyze how they were dealing with strangers. Little Red Riding Hood, how was she dealing with strangers? On the way to Grandma's house, she talked to the wolf, a stranger. How did Goldilocks deal with strangers? She went into a stranger's house. You're not supposed to go into a stranger's house. And if you were out on the road, out somewhere that was unfamiliar, you shouldn't be out talking to strangers. We all know that you shouldn't talk to strangers. We've identified how they're similar dealing with strangers, whether it's a stranger's house or actually talking to a stranger. Let's put our arrows to the similar box, and let's look at the effect of both of them talking or dealing with strangers. By talking to the wolf or going into the stranger's house, what happened? They were absolutely terrified by these strangers. Little Red Riding Hood was terrified because the wolf eventually tried to eat her, and Goldilocks was terrified because she woke up and she had 3 bears looking at her. But both were terrified by these strangers, which got them into trouble. We've identified our big idea, how they have similarities, which got both in trouble. We looked at the attributes, how they both were alone in the story, how they both dealt with strangers in the story. We then showed these similarities of being alone, of dealing with strangers, and then the effect. How did that affect them? How did that get them into trouble? Finally, at the end, let's put our S light bulb for our conclusion. Subject, Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks. I could repeat their names. I don't need to do that. I could just say these youngsters, these 2 youngsters. And I'm going to use youngsters because that's a great word to remind the reader that they were just little girls. And what about them? Had many similarities. You know, these similarities, basically what were they? Being alone, dealing with strangers. So common experiences. Who cares? Why is that so important? What's another word that I could do for trouble? Ooh, that put them into great danger. I have my big idea. Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks had similarities which explain why both faced trouble in their stories. First, both were alone. Little Red Riding Hood was on a long, faraway trail to try to reach her grandmother's house. Well, Goldilocks was deep in a wooded forest picking flowers and getting lost. These 2 characters experienced trouble in this case because they were both alone, unprotected, and young little girls, which anyone could prey upon. They also dealt with strangers. Little Red Riding Hood talked with the mean wolf on the way to her grandmother's house, and Goldilocks went into a stranger's house. Both, by dealing with strangers, were absolutely terrified when they faced these strangers. Little Red Riding Hood was terrified when the wolf tried to eat her, Goldilocks when she actually saw the 3 bears. Let's go to our conclusion and practice that. These 2 youngsters had common experiences in their story, which explain why both were in grave danger. There's our analysis, and in this case, we compared. I showed you both compare or contrast. At these grade levels, I highly suggest that you do one or the other. As children approach the upper grades, as we head into the 4th through 6th grade analysis, we will continue with compare or contrast. And when the students become fluent and master this type of thinking, then we will advance to putting the 2 together. But at this point, to really have that deep level of thinking, separate, compare, contrast. And remember, always start with the big idea. Explain why you are showing their differences or their similarities. Use your hand sign as a memory tool for you to fill out the body. And finally, we had the conclusion, which we repeated the big idea and why we were showing similarities or differences in the first place. This activity will definitely give you that deep thinking that our Common Core is requiring. Going in and analyzing two or more things so that your students can have that deep level of thinking. Good luck, and I think you're going to really enjoy this activity that you should use in any of your core subjects.